Hi, I'm David Lee. Welcome to Outside the Book. We're here on location here at the South Central Kentucky Festival of Books. And our first guest with us today on Outside the Book is Jack McDevitt. Jack is a science fiction writer whose work is often built around efforts to contact alien peoples. He's won numerous awards for his writing, including a Nebula Award from the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. Stephen King calls him the logical heir to Isaac Asimov and Arthur Clarke. His new book is Starhawk. And I'd say if Stephen King thinks you're a logical successor to Isaac Asimov, that's as good as any award you've ever won.
I'll take that and run with it, David.
What got you into writing, and maybe particularly into writing science fiction related work?
Well, you know, I was talking with a few people about that the other day, and I half suspect that if had it not been for science fiction, I never would have gotten started writing in the first place. But what got me started on science fiction was when I was about 4 or 5 years old. My father taking me to see the old Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers movie serials, 1940. And I can remember watching them come down in that great rocket ship they had, which by the way, went to Mars, had no washroom in it anywhere. I don't know how they did that. No airlock. And I don't think I noticed that stuff at the time, but I remember coming out of the theater one night. We were in downtown Philadelphia and row homes, and I looked up over the rooftops and I could see the moon. It was 1940. And I asked my father, I said, Dad, are we ever going to get to the moon? And he said, no, I'm sorry, kid. We're not going to do it because rockets don't work in outer space. You have to have something to push against. He lived to see it. By the way, my father was born before the Wright brothers flew, and he lived to see us land on the moon.
Wow.
That's how fast the technology is going.
Well, and you touch on a really interesting point with this whole concept of science fiction. How much of it is science and how much of it is fiction? How do you go about incorporating science into your fiction?
For me, I think the science provides the background. The book I've written that I most enjoyed the actual writing of was Time Travelers Never Die. They have a time travel device, obviously. And of course, we are never going to do time travel. That's impossible. I have no doubts whatever about that. So that makes it a fantasy. But it allows me to take characters back, and they can go and say hello to Will Shakespeare. They meet Will Shakespeare standing outside the Globe on the opening night for Hamlet. Now Shakespeare played the Hamlet's ghost, by the way, in that opening performance. But they're there, and they're fans. Hey, Will, great show. Love the show. That show is going to go far. And I enjoyed that. I really had a great time with that book.
The protagonist of Starhawk is a woman, Priscilla Hutchins.
That's correct.
What prompted you to write not just this book, but a series with a woman protagonist?
I used to do management training for the Customs Service. And one of the things they had us do was to run, we set up teams. And the teams were given problems to solve. Basically, they were the role play things. We put it, they were teams of 5. We'd put them in a plane, theoretically, and fly them out to Arizona and crash the plane. Their problem was to survive. Now, what we discovered was that there was no difference if the 5 people were agents or were customs inspectors or were administrators of some sort. They all lived and died at pretty much the same rate. The only place we saw a difference was in gender. Now, there were all male groups, obviously all male, all female, and sometimes mixed groups. Let me ask you, David, which group do you think died most, well, who do you think survived most often?
I'm going to guess that the women survived most often.
That's correct. Who do you think died most often?
I think the men died most often.
No, believe it or not, it was the mixed group. And the reason it was, and I used to watch, I watched it going on for years. The guys, you put women in the group, and the guys all become extra brave and start doing gutsy stuff that's dumb. And that was, and they get them. And the women would get in the roles also, and they would be they'd lie back a bit and go along with the guys, so they all get killed. So I thought, okay, I'm going to go with a woman who doesn't lie back very easily and tells people what she really thinks.
Well, when you also have a series with a male protagonist, so when you start to write one series or the other, how do you throw a switch in your head, or do you think about it consciously, the difference between the two?
Well, it's conscious, certainly. But the reality is Alex Benedict is the guy you're talking about. He's in the other series. He is an antiquarian who lives in the far future, and his books are about solving what are for him historical mysteries. They're mostly stuff in our future, but he goes around and he solves, what really happened at the Battle of what's its name? Okay, Chase Colpath is his female Watson in effect. She is the one who's there. She's there primarily to ask questions, but to a large extent, she keeps him out of trouble. Because he sometimes gets so involved in the history that he forgets to look out for the Indians.
Particularly in this age of social media and such, what do you hear from your readers? What do they say back to you about your work?
I think people, if they don't like what you're writing, they generally, at least my experience, they don't respond. I don't hear much that's negative. I did the first couple of years I was writing. I used to get. I would get email from people saying, why on earth are you writing about women so much? How come these strong women and these guys always stand aside? And I didn't think sometimes the guys still got themselves killed, it happens. But I did get some criticism in the beginning from that, but otherwise, no, mostly I get a lot of support. I get encouragement, and
Sounds
it's
great.
been a nice ride. I've been very fortunate.
Well, Jack McDevitt, author of Starhawk, thanks for being with us on Outside the Book.
David, my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Joining us now on Outside the Book is Alma Katsu. Her new book is The Descent. It's the third novel in her The Taker trilogy, following The Taker and The Reckoning. Her first novel, The Taker, was named a top 10 debut novel by the American Library Association, and she comes to writing after some 30 years as an intelligence analyst for the United States government. Alma, thanks for being with us on Outside the Book.
Thank you for having me.
This is the third book in a trilogy. Did you set out to write a trilogy?
No, I didn't. The first book, The Taker, was meant to be a standalone. But in the course of writing it, my agent had asked for a revision that really changed the nature of one of the characters. And after we did that revision, I saw that there was a continuation to the story, but it wasn't to the characters I thought it would be. It was to the villain. And it ends up being sort of the villain story for the next two books. So that's where that came from.
Are you sure that story is done at this point?
Actually I did come up with an idea for a fourth book, but you can't have a fourth book in a trilogy.
No, that's right.
So maybe someday down the road, yeah.
Your work is sometimes described, maybe by other people, as a mix of genres. What does that mean, and do you agree with it?
I have to say I do agree with it. I'm not exactly sure what it means. The books are very different. So they've been compared to everything from early Anne Rice, like Interview with the Vampire, to The Historian, which most people would think of more as literary fiction, to Diana Gabaldon's The Outlander series, and The Time Traveler's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger. I think what this means to me is it has a lot of elements. It's not exactly like any of those books. It's more mainstream fiction, but it has elements of historical and fantasy, and a little romance too.
I came across an intriguing quote from you. You said, "I love big, fat, daring fiction."
Yes.
What's big, fat, daring fiction?
Well, I like to think that my books are big, fat, daring fiction. But, I grew up reading a lot of the classics that a lot of other people read, like Alexander Dumas and Edgar Allan Poe. I like really big, interesting stories that you can get into. Some people might not classify Edgar Allan Poe as quite that way, but, he always had a very unique story. He was really the father of a lot of, the murder mystery and that sort of thing. So, I like challenging fiction. I like complex characters. I like really rich characters. I like stories that surprise you. So I tend towards those really big stories, and I hope readers do too.
Well, and particularly in that sense, how does the creative process work for you? I mean, do you see stuff in newspapers? Do you just totally make stuff up out of your head? Do you sort of go off by yourself for an hour and intentionally be creative? How does it work for you?
I'd like to think it's just that I come up with it, but the one thing I've learned now, the first book took me 10 years to write, because I was really learning the process at that time, and since then it's coming a little more quickly. I'm working on my fourth novel now, and one thing I'm finding is that what the stories are really about tend to come from something in the author's subconscious. It's usually something that you as a person are struggling with that maybe you're not even aware of. But that always seems to end up being the main problem of a book. So I have to say it just comes from deep within, whether you like it or not.
Well, I got to ask you the obvious question. I mean, you've had 30 years as an intelligence analyst. Not everybody has a career like that. You're with the RAND Corporation now. Is that a source of your work, or is what you do creatively totally independent of that?
Now, I do like to think that what I write is totally independent of that work. So I'm a technologist by trade. I work on technology issues for the government. I like to think there's absolutely no technology in my book, because they're all historical. This particular series spans from medieval Venice all the way to the present day. So there's very little technology in it. And the book I'm working on now is set in Georgian England. It's all historical. But the funny thing is when the first book came out and I was meeting with folks at Simon & Schuster, the publishers, one of the folks there asked me the same question: is there anything from the intelligence community in your books? And as I was about to say, no, I don't think so, she said, because all of the characters in it are so devious and manipulative and secretive. And I thought about it and I said, you're absolutely right. I hate to say it, but that is part and parcel of the intelligence community. It just kind of comes with the culture. You are around people that, they're always thinking, I'll put it another way, maybe not devious and manipulative, but you're always thinking about how to control a situation, all aspects of it. So there's a good bit of it. I spent most of my adult life now among people who are kind of like that all the time. So it comes out in my characters, apparently.
Alma Katsu, your book is The Descent. Thanks very much for being with us on Outside the Book.
Thank you for having me.
Our guest now on Outside the Book is Aram Goudsouzian. He is the chair of the history department at the University of Memphis, and he holds a PhD in history from Purdue University. He's the author of several books on African American history in particular, but his new book is Down to the Crossroads: Civil Rights, Black Power, and the Meredith March Against Fear. Aram, thank you very much for being with us on Outside the Book.
David, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much.
The march is maybe not very well known, certainly not as well known as some others, but it brings together several of the icons of the civil rights era: Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, James Meredith himself. Tell us a little bit about the interplay of these remarkable personalities in this event.
Sure. Well, it's an amazing story. It happens in June of 1966, and it begins with James Meredith, who of course is famous for integrating the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, 4 years earlier. And Meredith is a sort of singular, very quirky man, and he decides that he's going to lead a walk, really, from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi, about 220 miles. And along this, he's going to do it to encourage people to register to vote, and he's going to do it to defy the culture of intimidation and fear in Mississippi that's keeping black people from voting. On the second day of his march, he gets shot. And he survives the march. He survives the attack, but once he's attacked, it leads to all the major civil rights organizations coming to Memphis, determined to carry on Meredith's march. So as you say, it collects virtually every important figure in the civil rights movement in 1966 is marching through Mississippi in these 3 weeks in the summer of June of 1966. So it brings together Martin Luther King, who's still an archetype of nonviolence and racial integration, but it also brings Stokely Carmichael and SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is the most radical of the civil rights groups. And it's on this march that SNCC and Stokely Carmichael are first calling for black power. That's part of what makes the march so famous.
I'm intrigued by the title, Down to the Crossroads. Is that a deliberate reference to Robert Johnson, or is that just a coincidence?
No, it's definitely deliberate. This is obviously it's a crossroads in the civil rights movement, because with the call for black power, you can see this as the beginning of something with the rise of the Black Power movement, but also in some ways the end of something. It's the last great civil rights march, the last march where you bring together all the major civil rights organizations in this very creative interplay and with very many dramatic moments. But of course it's marching going through Mississippi and going through the Delta. And that's where Robert Johnson's famous crossroads is, where he made the deal with the devil. So it certainly plays on that, yeah.
Okay. The Meredith shooting is a bit mysterious as to the motives of the shooter. Talk a little bit about what you learned about that part of the march.
And that is one of the most fascinating aspects of this whole story, and one that had never really gotten much attention before. So when Meredith was shot, everyone assumed that it was by, a crazy white supremacist, a Klansman, something like that. And that's how sort of the liberal media tagged him, and they figured that this was going to be the spark to another great moment in civil rights history. But then the man himself, his name is Aubrey Norville, He was a man from Memphis, a hardware clerk, no known connection to any white supremacist organization, never really reveals the motive. Shot him with a birdshot rather than with a single bullet. So it became an interesting story because no one really knew his motives. So not only did pro-civil rights advocates blame him and try to use him, but also segregationists blamed him. They said, this is a guy, an outsider from Mississippi who came and he's trying to stir up trouble. The civil rights movement probably paid this guy. This was the argument that white supremacists were making at the time. And they said, oh, he wasn't trying to kill him, he was just trying to wound him with birdshot. Now, birdshot can kill you, of course, but this was the argument they were making.
Mm-hmm. You had a conversation with James Meredith.
I did.
What did Meredith have to say about this experience, and kind of what was your sense of Meredith as a personality?
I wouldn't say that I necessarily got a lot of direct information about the march from meeting with James Meredith and from interviewing him, but I did get a much better sense of him as a man. His charisma, his uniqueness, sort of what drives him. And in fact, just recently I got this very nice letter from James Meredith. He said, my name has been used in a lot of books. Yours is the first one that really sort of captures me as I see it. And he really gave me, it was really heartwarming praise because Meredith is a hard character to get a grasp on, and I worked really hard to try to tell his whole story, his whole picture. So I was really warmed in the heart from that letter from Meredith. Yeah.
What's the legacy of this march?
This march has a lot of legacies. One is that it helped to register a large number of black voters in Mississippi. Over 4,000 voters registered along the march route in those 3 weeks. More important probably, it signaled a new direction for a lot of black Mississippians. By joining this march, even if they just walked through town with Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael, they were in a lot of ways upsetting the old patterns of the past and challenging the notion of white supremacy. But it has a larger national and international legacy as well. The call for black power, and the way that would signal a new direction in the civil rights movement, the evolution of Martin Luther King, as he starts to really focus more on issues of poverty and class in his last few years of his life. And also an alienation of the federal government from the civil rights movement. There are many calls for Lyndon Johnson to have federal intervention on the march, federal protection. But in the last year since the Voting Rights Act, he's really drifted away from the movement, become consumed with Vietnam, and obsessed with black radicalism. And so this is one of the more tragic aspects of the story.
Our guest is Aram Goudsouzian, and his book is Down to the Crossroads, Civil Rights, Black Power, and the Meredith March Against Fear. Aram, thank you very much for joining us on Outside the Book.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Sure. And welcome back to Outside the Book. Joining us now is Jacinda Townsend. Jacinda's a native of here in South Central Kentucky. She's a graduate of Harvard, Duke University Law School, and University of Iowa. She's had a Fulbright. Her fiction is very widely published. She's a faculty member at Indiana University in Bloomington, and her new book is Saint Monkey, published by Norton's, and just recently reviewed very favorably in the New York Times Book Review. So Jacinda, welcome home, and thanks for being with us on Outside the Book.
Thanks for having me.
I'm intrigued that you're from Kentucky and the setting of Saint Monkey is in Kentucky. Why did you choose to set this novel in Kentucky?
Well, it's a love letter to a way of life that I think has kind of disappeared, especially in eastern Kentucky. And it's set in the 50s, so there's a lot of the diction that has not survived until now, and a lot of kind of the ways of life and mores that also have not survived. So I wanted to kind of preserve that time and place.
Why eastern Kentucky as opposed to South Central Kentucky?
I think that has to do with kind of artistic process. I think had I said it here, it would have been too tempting to make it autobiographical, in some small ways. So this way, eastern Kentucky is a place that I didn't know that well. So it's really straight from my imagination. So.
Well, one of many things that intrigues me about this novel is that it's a kind of an alternating conversation, or kind of it's told from the point of view of two women.
Yes.
How did you come up with that structure? And it's a very interesting and creative approach.
Sure. One of the girls one of the protagonists is very dreamy. She's very much about kind of the space between what's real and what she sees could be. The other one is very much her foil. She's really caustic and angry at the world, very pragmatic. She's just trying to get from point A to point B. And I think they were just really two sides of the same coin. So,
tell us a little bit about the creative origins of these two characters.
Sure.
is this a kind of inner dialogue within yourself, or are these conversations that you've kind of put together over years, or where does this conversation come from?
I think both things are true. So to some extent, the more caustic character was a part of me that I'm afraid to show the world. So she kind of came out, but also I went because I wanted to explore the role of women in the 50s. So I wanted two women who were so different and yet kind of ended up constrained. You know, one leaves Kentucky, she goes to New York. She's a brilliant pianist, but she still ends up like very much constrained by the menfolk of the jazz era. So I wanted to explore those two different people.
What comes? Is this possibly the first of more novels about these characters, or
you know,
what do you do
that's
next
a good
here?
question. What I'm working on now is two different voices, but it's a really different world. It's modern day, but it's set partially in Indiana and partially in Morocco.
Oh, wow.
So it's about a woman who has escaped slavery in Mauritania and is stuck in Morocco, and then an American woman who adopts her child, but she's really kidnapped the child. So it's about what happens after that.
So Kentucky and Harlem, Indiana and Morocco, geography is important to your creative process.
Yes, a sense of place is really important to me. I spend a lot of time researching setting. I spend a lot of time researching this particular setting, like the 50s, and you know, even down to what kind of seats were in the Apollo. I spent so much time on this setting, so it's really important to me. And what's pleasing is when I hear from somebody who was that age and lived through it, and you know, says, "Oh my gosh, how did you know that?" So it's paid off.
I have to ask you something about your career odyssey. You have an undergraduate degree from Harvard, and you have a degree from Duke University Law School.
Yes.
And
yes.
you decide, all things considered, I'd rather be a creative writer.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that change.
Okay, I think I had always wanted to write. I had always been interested in the arts. It was my first love. And I think like a lot of kids, I was continually dissuaded from thinking that that could be a real life, right? And so I went and I got a law degree, and then the older I got, the more I thought, I love that. I love that life, and I want to do it. And so eventually, the courage to do it kind of outweighed all the dissuasion in my head, you know? And things have been magical ever since I made that decision, so.
Well, anybody who's read your work is going to be really glad you made that decision.
Well, thank you.
Jacinda Townsend, thank you very much for being
Thanks
with us
for
on
having
Outside
me.
the Book. Our pleasure.
Nice talking to you.
Welcome back to Outside the Book. This is David Lee, and our guest now is Courtney Stevens. She grew up in Kentucky. She lives in Nashville, Tennessee. She's a college teacher, a youth minister, a tree climber, an Olympic torchbearer. She's a pretty fair softball player who holds the Lindsey Wilson college record for hits in a career, and she's a pretty fair writer as well. Faking Normal is her first novel.
Yes, absolutely. That was
Courtney-
quite an introduction.
Well, thanks for being with us on
you.
Outside the Book.
Thank you for having me.
Where did this story come from for you?
Oh, that is such a great question. I used to write fantasy, and I paid for a critique in Los Angeles, and the editor read the critique I had on fantasy, and she kind of looked at me when we were sitting down and talking, and she said, you know, this is good, but I don't think it's the book you have to write, and I want to know the book only you can write. And I was like, wow, what is the book only I could write? And so I kind of went back to my thinking place, and I asked myself, if adult me could go back and talk to teenage me for one moment in time, where would I be and what would I say to myself? And the book came from that.
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, I'm intrigued by the title, partly because I start writing my own book when I hear the title, but the title is Faking Normal.
Yes, Faking Normal.
Where did the title come from?
Well, that's exciting because the original title of Faking Normal was 23 because of something that happened in the novel. And my agent and I went kind of back and forth on, like, what's the thing that really, really not just sells this book, but speaks to an audience. And as soon as Faking Normal kind of arrived on our list, we're like, that's it, because so many people, we find it's the story of their life. You know, like people ask you, have you had a good day? And you immediately say, okay, it's fine. You know, and like, but you might not have had a good day. You might have had a terrible day. And so to some degree, because we all do that, there's a universal feature to it. And so hopefully it would attract people to it. But for my main character, it's her life. You know, she has a secret, and she feels a lot of shame because of that, but she doesn't want anyone to pity her. And so she thinks the best course of action is to keep that in and to just get up every day and act like everything is totally normal, you know?
Let me ask you a practical question.
Sure.
How did you find the time to write this book?
Wow. So I was a youth minister, and I'm also a college professor. And here's the thing. I don't think that you find time, you make time. The things that you love and the things that you have to do, you just say, I'm going to do this. And so I decided, because I wanted to write a novel, I would treat it like a part-time job that no one ever paid me for. And so it took 15 hours of my week, and I set them aside to write. And I'm like, someday maybe somebody will pay me for this, but until then, I'm going to do it no matter what. And it took me, I started writing seriously, like it was a part-time job, in 2007, and the book came out in 2014. So 7 years of unpaid work to get to paid work. So yeah.
So do you consider yourself a writer of young adult fiction, or does it just happen that that's where your stories fall?
I like to say that you need to be 13 to read this book. You don't have to be anything else. Like it's 13 and up. It's kind of like, you ever see a board game, you know, and you just have to be a certain age to start there?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what this book is. I don't think you have to be a teenager to understand this girl or her story or what's going on in her life. I think a wide variety of ages. I've talked to a 92-year-old, a 93-year-old, a 20-year-old, a 50-year-old that have all said, I found myself here. And so I like to think that it does give teenagers a certain degree of hope because it's their setting, but that it fits everyone, you know?
How do you find an audience for your work? And I ask that partly because I came across a quote from you that part of what goes on is kind of marketing your personality. Talk a little bit about what you mean by that.
Well, here's the thing. This book is not for everyone, and I know it. But some of the mantras in it are life mantras for me. Like one of them is channel your brave. And I've met a lot of people that don't necessarily need to read that book, but I've never met someone that doesn't deal with fear on some level. And I'm like, if I can get that message to people, that channel your brave message, it outlives this book. I'm going to write another book, and a book, hopefully another book after that, another book after that. I think the thing that holds those books together is me. And so I kind of like to think of it as playing the long game. I do a lot better not just to sell this book, but to try and sell someone on, I'm a person that's willing to invest in them, wherever they are in their journey, and that maybe one of those books will hit on them, you know? It seems smarter to me than to do that than to just try and sell one book.
Courtney Stevens, Faking Normal sounds like a great place to start, and I hope you do have many more books down the road.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
It's been wonderful to have you here on Outside the Book.
Thank you for having me.
I'm David Lee here at the Southern Kentucky Festival of Books. Thanks for joining us here on Outside the Book.